All right, welcome to another Conscious Builder Live. I'm your host, Casey Gray, and today we have Abby Kinney on with us. Abby, thanks so much for being here with us.
Hi, Casey. Thanks for having me.
So, Abby is the co-host of the Upzoned podcast and is an urban design and planning consultant at Gould Evans Studio for city design in Kansas City, Missouri. Graduate of the University of Missouri, Kansas City Department of Architecture. She holds a BA in urban planning and design. So I have to admit, I don't know a lot about urban planning and design, but I am interested in it because obviously we are building homes in these urban areas. So I'm very interested in getting into what we're about to talk to in the 15-minute neighborhoods and so forth. I have a lot of questions for you. But maybe before we get into the quick presentation that you have, that I'm sure will bring up all sorts of other questions for me, what's a day in the life of Abby look like? You know, what does a planning consultant do? What are the projects you're working on?
Well, that's funny that you say that because when I was a student, did not know what an urban planner was. I actually started in the Department of Architecture, which was in the same building as the Department of Urban Planning. And when I learned what urban planning was, I realized that is what I was actually interested in, not necessarily design of the buildings, but design of the community as a whole, how things come together, how do you facilitate that. So I was very lucky to discover what urban planning was, and now have the opportunity to work with communities and cities and developers around the country, around the continent, and helping them coordinate how development occurs, whether that is through creating zoning codes, whether that's through creating master plans. We provide those services with people as consultants to create more coherent communities.
So you're working around the world, you said, or across country?
We
Like,
work primarily in North America, so the U.S. and Canada.
so what cities are leading the way, in your opinion, in this urban planning area and how they plan their city and manage their cities?
Well, that's a really good question. Every city is a little bit different. Every community is different in terms of their priorities, but something that we focus on primarily is how people are reinvesting in themselves. As I'm sure we'll talk about today, Strong Towns has helped people understand how we have, invested in ourselves in ways that don't actually create a lot of value, and cities that are using tax dollars, the dollars that we all pay every year, to reinvest in our own communities in ways that not only create a return on investment in the long term, but create sustainable communities. So cities that are recognizing the value of doing that and moving forward in that way, I think, are the cities of the future.
So so I was going to get into your presentation, but I do have a couple more questions as we're chatting
That's
here.
okay.
So in your mind, like, what is a sustainable community? What does that mean?
Well, I would say that it's a city that takes their tax dollars and invests in streets that are multimodal, invests in encouraging small development on vacant lots, reuse of existing buildings, investing in the city that we have rather than just sprawling out on the edges. For the past 70 years, we've really come to think of the idea of growth at any cost as being good, and so we've spread out our cities in a way that is unprecedented in human history. And that has come with a set of associated costs that we can't necessarily pay for in the long term. And so, we not only want to grow productively, but we want to grow in a way that is not taking from the existing residents in a community. It's not undermining the needs of people in neighborhoods.
So yeah, as you talk, I get more and more questions. So maybe let's get into your presentation, and then maybe this will answer some of my questions, and then we can go from there.
Yeah, I'd be happy to go into this presentation. I put together this presentation because you guys were kind of asking, what is Strong Towns doing? What's the types of things that we're looking at as city planners, and how does that impact how we build cities. So again, I work with the Strong Towns organization on one of their podcasts called Upzoned, which is focused on taking current events related to the economy, related to cities, and upzoning them. We talk about them in depth. They also have two other podcasts. One is the Strong Towns podcast, which is conducted by the founder of Strong Towns, Chuck Marone. And there's also It's the Little Things, which is a podcast focused on the little things that communities are doing to incrementally evolve their neighborhoods. So kind of more of the social impact, things that just neighbors are doing to make their community stronger. Chuck Marone recently published a book that anybody who is involved in city building, I recommend them read. It's probably one of the best books I've read in years. It's called A Bottom-Up Revolution to Rebuild American Prosperity. It basically summarizes, it's a manifesto that summarizes what Strong Towns is all about and how it impacts city planning. So highly recommend it. It's very, very good. The way we think about this is that it's kind of a story of unintended outcomes. So, because you guys are focused on home building, I will just use the house analogy that imagine if you inherited a house and you were responsible for making sure that it is standing in the future. So, to do that, you would save money and make sure that you have the capabilities to maintain the roof and the foundation and the HVAC and the AC and the insulation and windows, all of the things that make sure that it has structural integrity. But if you instead, inherited this house and built a flat screen TV and an addition on the house and all new furniture, that's kind of like what we've done with a lot of cities all across our continent, unfortunately. Um, when we built cities for thousands of years, we came to similar conclusions about how that's done, despite different languages, different cultures, different architectural styles and materials available all across the world. So, in cities that were built prior to, I usually use the 1950 as the year that we changed the way we build. You'll see that cities were based on proximity. It mattered a lot how far you could walk with a gallon of milk. You had to be able to do that in 15 minutes, which is where the 15-minute city idea comes from. Unfortunately, we think that's a new idea. It's not really a new idea. It's the way we built for thousands of years, but we've kind of forgotten that. After the 1950s, we got something called the car. And once we did that, it changed the way that we built. American cities really, really loved to build communities around the car. And it wasn't necessarily a bad thing that we all got cars. It made life a lot more convenient. It was helpful economically for people, but it changed the way that we actually built the built environment. And that means that we have a lot more infrastructure that we are responsible for taking care of. In my own town of Kansas City, back in 1950, we had about 500,000 people living in 81 square miles. And today we have 4 times as much city that we need to maintain and about the same population. And this is something that we're seeing, in many different cities. Kansas City is not alone in that. This is how many lane miles we have. We could go from New York to San Francisco and then back and then up to Portland, Maine. Urban 3 is an organization that is also associated with Strong Towns, and they help cities do the math on how much infrastructure they are responsible for taking care of. We use the simple math of 4 times as much city to maintain, but when you look at all the fire hydrants, pipe, streets, we can see that it's often 10, 20 times more than back in 1950. One way they help cities understand this is by measuring value per acre. So this is a heat map as well as the 3-dimensional map that shows where our city is most economically potent and where we're probably losing money each year. So in the middle of our city, our downtown and urban core, it's really showing us that it's the economic driver for the entire city that is helping to subsidize all of our outskirts. And that's important because we really need to invest in that economic driver if we're going to have a sustainable future. You can express that in sales taxes. I don't know exactly how taxes are done in Canada, but in the United States, we pay taxes based on the value of our house. So if we have a $250,000 house, we pay the same as any other $250,000 house. It doesn't really matter how much land, how much infrastructure you're using up. And that wasn't something back in 1950. We didn't sit down and rethink our tax system and rethink how we're going to pay for all this stuff. We just kind of inherited our tax system and then built a completely different way and didn't think about what we're actually producing in terms of value and what we all need to pay for in the future, in terms of our public liabilities. What we see in kind of the traditional development pattern, which I typically think of as communities built before 1950, is that they're incredibly resilient, and that if their housing were to drop to $50,000 per unit, the value per acre stays higher than some of the more spread out and sprawling communities that are of higher value. So it kind of flips how we think about what is valuable and what is not. We typically think of the brand new subdivisions as where cities are getting all their tax value, and that the poorer neighborhoods are the neighborhoods that are bleeding everybody dry. But that is actually not the case when we look at the efficiency of development pattern. So it's a really important thing that we kind of try to help cities understand and see the value of simply the pattern of their development. And, with this in mind, we really help cities to consider long-term returns on new infrastructure investments, as well as increasing their revenue in more productive ways, in reusing existing infrastructure. That means promoting infill housing, promoting reuse of existing building stock, so that we're using our infrastructure more efficiently. And depending on what kind of outcomes you're seeing in your tax policy, we really promote that we're actually looking critically at our tax policies and seeing what the unintended outcomes are. So, for example, in our city and in many cities in the United States, we have a situation where our tax policy incentivizes vacant lots and parking lots and absentee owners to buy up properties and let properties deteriorate, and they pay very little taxes on that. And so that brings down neighborhoods and is a more extractive way of investing in neighborhoods rather than trying to build up communities. So this is one of our main, values as a planning studio, which is right in the middle, that great cities protect their inheritance. We, really like to focus on fiscal sustainability because it helps us understand what kinds of cities we are leaving for future generations. And that's something that we have not been taking very seriously as a society for many, many years. And now that we can see this problem, we can start to understand how we can turn the needle, among many other considerations. The fact that cities are for people, the fact that great cities are defined by the quality of their public space. We often forget that cities are not just private investments. It's also how we build our streets, how we design the public realm. Great cities are shaped by many hands. So it's not just a few developers who are responsible for building the city. There's many people who can contribute to reinvestment in their community. And the more local, the better. And great cities build community. So the way that we plan our cities needs to be a collection of the shared interests of residents in the community. So that's really how we practice as a planning group, and some of what Strong Towns is focusing on.
So one of the things that comes to mind for me is the obvious pandemic that happened, COVID, and how I'm seeing a change here. You can stop sharing your screen, by the way, if you'd like,
Sure.
unless you have more to share. So thanks for that, by the way.
Yeah.
So it sounds like obviously like that 50-minute neighborhood makes a lot of sense, and I actually enjoy that. So one of the things that has actually changed in my life since COVID has happened, uh, we're in a location, we're kind of outside of Ottawa, but we're on the outskirts of Ottawa, but we're close enough to a town called Manotick, so we can actually walk into town. Like my wife just went and got groceries, and she walked there. But that was something that we weren't doing before. We were just busy. We were driving. We had to go into the city all the time. But since this has happened, and obviously the weather's nice right now, we take advantage of things like that. Things change when it's minus 25
Yeah, I
degrees
bet.
Celsius. But one of the things that we've noticed is that this neighborhood has really started to take off since COVID-19 because people are realizing that they don't need to commute into the city. So people are actually looking for more space, right? They want to be outside of the city. They don't want to be on top of their neighbors. They're kind of looking. I think this area in particular is nice because you do have everything you need fairly close. Whether or not it's a 15-minute walk will depend on where you're at, but it's still somewhat. It's a really nice small town kind of feel. So, what have you seen change over the last 4 or 5 months?
Well, that's fascinating because I've had a similar experience. I am lucky enough to have a job where I'm working from home now. I have not been to the office since March, and that enables me to. I actually have a lot more free time now because I can kind of get things done as I'm taking breaks during lunch. I can walk over to the butcher in my area, walk my dog, kill a few birds with one stone, and do things more locally. And something that I think is really resilient about the neighborhood that I live in is that there's there there's lots of people who are living here, not only in apartments but also compact single family home. It's a very efficient development pattern, but it's a traditional neighborhood layout, and people are out. We never saw a lack of people during this COVID time. It actually seemed like there were plenty of locals who were going to the small grocery store, the corner stores, and I think that that kind of boils down to building a collection of villages rather than just building a city with a really dense downtown and then suburbs. And that's kind of a way that we've built cities for many generations now. And I think that it's more resilient if we are building cities that are a collection of villages, so that you don't necessarily have to go downtown and live in a bedroom community and just commute downtown every day. And that's where everything is. And in the age of COVID, you really don't want to have one place that the whole region is going to every day, so that we can all go to one place, whether it is the downtown or it's Walmart. You don't really want to have those regional places where everybody comes and spreads germs and then goes to where they live. It's great to have 15-minute neighborhoods because it kind of contains our networks. And that is something that I've heard a lot of people talking about. I've seen it in my own community. And yeah, we should be building more villages, I think.
Yeah, that's a good point. When people are looking at stats, if people are concerned about safety and getting sick or anything like that, it's almost like instead of looking at this stat for your state or your province or your city, you should be looking at the stats for your community where you stick to locally, which would probably be a better way of looking at least for your own personal safety. So I like the way you laid that out in terms of a collection of villages. So now you had mentioned that by kind of sprawling the city out, though, it becomes more expensive for the city. Are you saying that a collection of villages would actually save money for the city, or how would that work, right? Because that's a whole new world for me. Like, obviously I understand there's property taxes and you're paying for all sorts of things, especially around here when it comes to winter and snow removal. It can get a little crazy, and that's usually where things are way over budget on snow removal this year because we keep getting more and more, right? But I haven't followed that a lot in the recent years. But it is something that's interesting that I would like that I'm starting to get more involved with the community that I mentioned, Manotick. But will a collection of small villages help that or continue to make it worse like you described?
So the 16 square mile area that I showed on that map, that is really the economic driver for my community, is essentially a collection of villages because it was built during a time where we had a very robust streetcar network. And so when the streetcars were built, we had 100, I think we had 100 miles of streetcar that people used to get around. And during the time that those were built, people built villages around those streetcar stops because it was convenient for people to get off a streetcar, buy what they needed, and then walk to where they lived. And that was just the way that people lived. It turns out that that is a very efficient development pattern in terms of the economics behind it. And not only is it good in the age of COVID, it's also good long term as we're thinking about how we're going to pay for infrastructure. So, if we were to kind of flip that and look at how we build commercial centers in kind of the conventional way, the big box centers, um, they use a lot more infrastructure. They typically have very large parking lots, they have very large roads, a lot of infrastructure that is associated with, a handful of stores that are going to be in that area, with the question of whether or not those stores will be there in 20 years. So, in again, you can't necessarily walk to those places unless your subdivision is directly next to them. So it's not particularly a very walkable type of setting, and it's not a very desirable walk if you were to walk in many cases. So when we're thinking about whether or not it's you're going to have a return on investment in one versus the other, I think that kind of the compactness, the concentration of the development pattern, especially commercial development patterns, and the connectivity around that will reduce the amount of parking that you need, which is a very inefficient use of land, especially in areas that are valuable. So typically I would say yes, building villages is going to be a better bet for you in the future. I think it boils down to how those places are designed, because we do see a lot of kind of I like to call them just like faux villages, like they're old Main Street development projects that are disconnected from anything around it. Like they're essentially drive-to village centers, and I don't know that those are necessarily going to be the future of our towns and neighborhoods. In If we're building kind of more resilient patterns that we can see were built before, we're going to have a better bet in getting the long-term return on investment that we need to sustain our quality of life.
Mhm. So I feel like the public transit though is going to change because a lot of people don't necessarily want to hop on to a bus or a subway or whatever it may be. Uh, so that I'm assuming will play some sort of role in this. And I do agree that parking is a waste of space. Now, what about these self-driving cars that are on the horizon, right? And there's been a lot of talk about electric cars here in Ottawa and having the infrastructure to be able to charge those cars. But I think what a lot of people miss is that not everyone's necessarily going to own a car, because soon with self-driving cars, it's going to make car ownership obsolete, right? If you can just call your car and come pick you up and you don't actually need to have a parking space for it. Now, eventually those cars do need to park somewhere if they're not being used, but it does reduce the amount of cars that are just parked sitting there because they're constantly driving around picking people up. So is that factored into a lot of the planning that you're doing? Like, are you thinking technology, what's coming, like how are people going to commute versus just looking at the way people commuted in the past?
Yes. So that is a really interesting subject that you bring up, because a lot of what is driving how we invest in our cities has to do with transportation. How are people getting there? First of all, I typically say for every parking space you think you need, just build a residential unit somewhere within walking distance of the destination, because we really should be prioritizing the people who are there first and making sure that we have the capacity for whatever commercial setting that we're building. So build in the capacity, make sure that there are people nearby to actually go to these businesses and support them. In terms of driving, yeah, if we have self-driving cars, we're not necessarily going to need as much parking space. Today that we're seeing scooters, I don't know if you have scooters in your own city, but we have them all over the place, these electric scooters that people are using to get around. There's electric bikes that are becoming more and more popular, as well as just regular old school type of bikes. So I think people are starting to recognize that there's more than one way to get around. And so long as cities are making sure that they're investing, reinvesting in themselves, building streets, designing streets that are going to help facilitate all of these different users, they're going to be able to have, that they're going to have a more sustainable community and a more attractive community in the future, because people are really wanting to, not necessarily be burdened with car ownership in all cases. Some people really like having a car. I know it's convenient for a lot of people, but if you could call one up, I don't know that everybody would really want to have to do a monthly car payment and insurance. It would release a lot of burden and help people with their own quality of life if they didn't have to own their own car.
Or maybe it gets the families that own two vehicles, maybe they can do one vehicle now, knowing that they have that as a
Yeah,
benefit, right? Because I know, like,
exactly.
after owning vehicles for so long, it's like the freedom of being able to leave and go and do whatever you want whenever you want is definitely nice.
Yes, it's definitely nice. I could see us, we have two cars currently, and now that I'm working from home, I'm kind of wondering why we have the second car parked out on the street, because I almost never use it anymore. And so if this were something a little more long term, if I were able to get easy access to a car when I really needed it, I probably would go car light, maybe just have one car per household, and we wouldn't need as much street space that we use right now.
Yeah. Now, what about homes that are like off-grid homes? I know a lot of homes, like when you go out into, or even homes that don't rely on city water or sewers, for example. So like well and septic homes. How do those play into what you're doing? Because we have a lot, like where we are right now, the house I'm living in right now is well and septic, right? So we don't rely on city water. There's no actual city infrastructure. I guess we do have like snow plows and street cleaning and so forth. But how does that play into? Does that help cities, or does it hurt them, or is it kind of neither?
Well, I would say that it helps cities. So, typically the expectation, if you're living in a rural area, is that you're not going to have the same level of city services, city infrastructure that you would have when you're living in the core of downtown. And that's why a lot of houses are on septic. Maybe you'll see gravel roads. It's less street lights, less, uh, fire hydrants. All of that infrastructure is not really needed when you're living in a rural setting. The the unbalance that we see in areas that are kind of more conventional suburban settings is that it expects the same level of city services and infrastructure that you would see in the core of downtown, yet produces much less efficient development patterns. So it's really that middle ground where we're seeing that imbalance. But when you get further out to small towns and rural areas, you're not going to have this extreme level of infrastructure need. There's more balance there.
Where my wife and I were actually looking at a house, and I'm feeling quite good about it because it's actually closer to the town of Manotick, but it's still on well and septic too. So it's like we have less of a walk, less distance to travel, and we're not putting all the strain on the city services. So, anyways,
Yeah, that's awesome.
now what about homes like off grid? So one of the things like what we build in terms of conscious building and sustainable homes, we haven't done an off grid home yet. It hasn't made financial sense for any of the clients who have hired us. However, where I can see it making sense is typically on a bigger lot where it costs a lot to get connected to the utilities, for like, which is really going to be electricity. So if you buy a big piece of property and you put your house really far, and the electrical company is going to charge you thousands of dollars to connect, it might make sense just to do solar panels and battery instead. Now, that being said, it's typically cheaper when you're in the city to connect into everything. And they don't even allow, like, you can't put a septic in the middle of the city, or put well, nor would you probably want to drink that water. But would things like, is that factored into your planning too? Like maybe like these little villages that you're talking about, could they also be self-sustaining villages?
I think they certainly could be. I've seen the concept of eco villages. I don't know if you've seen that before, where it's a bunch of these kind of ecologically sustainable houses that are arranged into a community, and they're very, like, I think they're completely self sufficient. And so, you have electricity being produced. I'm not sure what they do about their sewer system, but I'm sure it's some sort of septic system. I bet you'd have a gravel road leading up to this area, so no need to pay for paved infrastructure or anything like that. And if you could even grow your own food in this way, and I think that that is a model for sustainable development for those who are interested in living in that setting. So I guess I would make clear that there's not just one way of building a village. You can build a village in lots of different ways, and I'm very excited about the technology that's coming out around sustainability and home building, because that could be something that could help make communities even more self-sufficient, especially as electricity is becoming so expensive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and a big part of whenever I talk with homeowners is helping them realize that the biggest part of your electricity, especially the types of homes that we build, is going to be all the plug loads. Typically, heating your hot water,
Mm.
right? If you have 4 teenagers living there, you're going to be heating a lot of water. But also, if everyone has like a phone and a laptop and an iPad, and there's 7 TVs in the house, and now everyone's working from home, like it's usually the plug loads. The heating demand only a few months out of the year where it's higher, and it's a lot lower in the homes that we build. That you can't change the hot water necessarily, or not very much. That's really about how people live in the home. So it's understanding that technology makes our life easier, but it can also add all of those other things. You need battery, you need power to power that technology.
Yeah.
So what about, before I went on my little rant, I had another thought and I just lost it. It'll come back to me. All right. So what do we do? Yeah, this is what it is. So what do we do with these communities that are hurting our cities and that are costing more on the infrastructure? Like, what do you suggest that we do with those? Like, what should cities be doing with those areas that have the big box stores and that have all the houses that are spread out, that are designed to be driven to, right? Basically, and you see, like, you go into these neighborhoods and they're just lines of cars because people have more cars than parking spaces
Yeah.
in their neighborhood, right? And it's kind of funny, and it stresses me out to some extent, but good thing I meditate. But it's, what's the solution, right? As we start to think a little bit better about how we're going to plan our communities.
Yeah, well, I guess I'll start with something that Chuck Marohn from Strong Towns often says, and that is that problems have solutions and predicaments have outcomes. And what we're dealing with in terms of fiscal sustainability of cities is a predicament. And we are going to have to try to manage what the outcomes are of that predicament. In some cases, we typically say that cities should be very careful about investing in new infrastructure, continuing to spread out, continuing to spend millions and millions of tax dollars, our tax dollars, on building out and spreading out, because we could be spending that money on reinvesting in the existing community.
Sorry, I just have one question before you continue. So would
Sure.
that go for, in this area, for example, one of the things that they put a stop on is we can't do any more like estate subdivisions, which around here would be all well and septic. So if you have 100 acres and you can break that into 2-acre parcels and run a road through there, but nobody's on city water, nobody's on city sewers, is a community like that helpful for the city, or is that also hurting? Is that something that you would prevent as well?
I think it depends on who is maintaining the roads in that subdivision.
It's typically the city in this case, right? So it would.
Yes. So what a smart city manager or planning department would do is they would try to understand what that community is going to be producing through their property taxes each year. And then they would practice accrual accounting, which is understanding how much those streets are going to cost. The life cycle of a street is usually about 50 years, and that only maintains for that. It only stays that long if you maintain it, which is typically a 15-year cycle that you have to go and do the mill and overlay process. So you would do the accounting to try to set a reasonable expectation for, if you were to set aside money each year to eventually pay for repaving the street, eventually reconstructing the street. Are you making enough money every year essentially to do that? And if you aren't, let's say that it's going to cost $60,000 a year that you have to set aside, or whatever it would end up being, and you're not making that, then that money has to come from somewhere, because a generation from now, when our kids are the city council members and they now have to figure out how to deal with the streets in this neighborhood, and they didn't plan for it, nobody planned for it, and they need the money for it, where is it going to come from? Maybe it comes from the state, and so now the
We
community
just print
is,
money now, don't we? So it's fine.
yeah, we just print money. Yeah, we don't worry about inflation, we just print it.
That's a separate one. Yeah. We'll leave
Yeah.
that topic for another one.
Yeah. So that's kind of the question that we need to be asking ourselves is do we have more liabilities than we have value? And it sounds like a heartless question to ask, but it's a question that is real, because if we are not able to maintain the streets, then eventually one day the city might say, sorry, we can't afford to maintain your streets. You asked what do you do with places like that? In some cities, I've seen I've seen one city where they've actually gone into a neighborhood and told them, we cannot afford to maintain your streets, we're turning it back to gravel. And people, reasonably are very upset about that, because they bought into a community that had paved streets. Now the city is saying there's no way we can afford to do this. And so that's something that that can be a real problem.
Yeah, for sure. Especially if people want to keep their car clean.
Yeah,
But
absolutely. So again, managing what the outcomes are of that predicament, I think it's going to be different for different cities, how they choose to deal with that.
oh, sorry, we lost you. I think you're back now.
Hi,
Yeah,
I'm
you're back.
back.
Sorry, continue.
Well, I was going to say that Memphis, Tennessee has run the math on this situation, and they have chosen to de-annex parts of their city and say, either, I don't know if they're giving them back to the county or if they're allowing them to become their own communities and their own municipalities, but they've realized that they cannot afford to pay for various parts of their city that they've annexed over the years, and so they've decided to step away from those areas and de-annex them from the city. So, I think city managers are probably going to be making these decisions in the future and figuring out how they're going to be managing their books. Unless we can just print money and keep this all going forever.
Yeah. It almost comes back in my mind to the little villages where you give each village the ability to manage their own portion of that, right? So,
Yeah.
and then you need, instead of trying to figure it out for everybody, it's like, all right, you're in charge of this area, you're in charge of this area. And you start to build these villages, which is easier said than done. I definitely know that. But who knows? So it'll be interesting to see what happens, especially, like I said, with everything that's happening right now.
Yeah, that's actually something that I've thought about. Again, we work with lots of different cities, and their geographic areas vary very greatly. Kansas City, Missouri, like I mentioned, is 320 square miles, which is huge for a city. And then there are cities that take up only a handful of square miles. And I have found that cities with less land area and less different contexts that they're dealing with, if it's essentially one village that they're trying to manage, it's much easier for them to manage that rather than having all different kinds of contexts, all different kinds of communities with different values. I wonder why we have such expansive and large cities that are trying to balance all of these different stakeholder needs. In the future, I would hope that we could start to think about managing assets and liabilities at the smallest scale possible.
Mhm. Now, before we go, this has been a whole lot of information. This is great, and I'm realizing that I'm actually quite interested in this stuff as well. So,
Well,
the
please continue to follow Strong Towns.
yeah. So tell us a little bit. So that's where I was going to go next. Is tell us a little bit about the podcast and what you shared, what you talk about on the podcast, and where people can go to find it.
Yeah, absolutely. So I host a weekly podcast called Upzoned. It's focused on current events. So we take a story in the news each week that touches the Strong Towns conversation, and we upzone it. We talk about it in depth. And so that has to do with cities, the economy. We actually have an episode that is being released tomorrow that is responding to a New York Times article about the changes that are happening right now in New York and what that means for their long-term outlook. So we talk about all different.
What are the changes happening in New York?
So glad you asked.
Or do we have to listen to the episode tomorrow?
You have to listen to the episode, but as a spoiler, I will say that rents have dropped by a reported 10% and are going down in New York City for the first time in 10 years. So what does that mean for New York? Maybe cheaper rents. What does it mean for the long term is questionable, but we discuss it and get into that a little bit more. And so that'll be released tomorrow. It's called Upzoned through Strong Towns.
That's great. And how long have you been doing this podcast for now?
I've been doing this podcast since January.
Okay.
So I started it. Yeah. I started at the beginning of the year, pre-COVID. So didn't realize we'd have such intense current events happening. So we talk a lot about different things associated with this pandemic and the changes around that we're experiencing in cities. But we've been affiliated with Strong Towns, had a relationship with Strong Towns for a number of years now. They're doing fascinating work, for anybody who is interested in cities or community building or, this subject in general. I would highly recommend you look into Strong Towns because it has really changed my perspective on urban planning and community building.
So for anybody watching, listening, that's strongtowns.org, and you can get all the information there. So, Abby, if people want to get in touch with you, what's the best way to do that?
Good question. Well, I guess I'll say that I am on Twitter at AbbyKatKC, so ABBYKATKC. And then we also have our website of our firm, and that's gouldevansplanning.com.
And do you have any parting words of advice or asks maybe for the listeners and viewers that you would like to get out to as many people as possible?
Well, I would just say to keep doing what you can to build strong towns, which is how I end every single episode. But no, seriously, I just I see the work that is happening at Strong Towns and think that it's really important to sustainability. I know you guys work in the sustainability fields. You're thinking about what we're leaving to generations after us, and that is exactly the type of work that we're doing in the fiscal sustainability realm. Although I think, ecological sustainability plays into that. We are trying to really ask ourselves what kind of communities we're leaving behind for future generations, and if they're going to be able to have a high quality of life that we all expect today. So I hope that everybody considers that and gets involved in their local communities to help build stronger towns.
Yeah, that's great. That's actually something I'm looking forward to doing because we've kind of been up in the air and we weren't sure which community we were going to land in, and everything kind of became very clear once COVID hit. So I'm actually looking forward to getting more involved in our community here and doing exactly what you're doing, right? Just understanding how it works and having a little bit of say in what happens and how it gets developed for many different ways. Because even the home that we're looking at it'd be really nice if there's a sidewalk for all these houses, not just ours, but everyone along this road. And there's nowhere to walk really. There's a big shoulder, but it's not like a nice place to walk. But I'm looking forward to doing that. So,
well, Abby, just remember that every great community has somebody behind it that really cares about it. And that's why it's so great.
Yeah.
So you can be that person.
I will try to live up to that. So Abby, thank you so much for being on the show. This has been great and very eye-opening for myself.
Awesome. Thank you, Casey. And I look forward to following the work that you guys are doing.
Thanks, Abby.
Thanks.